Hello, everybody. My name is Jocelyne Cesari. I am a professor of religion and politics at the University of Birmingham and in the UK and at Georgetown University. And I am the head of the section of religion and IR. And it's a great pleasure to welcome you today to the new session of our virtual book talk series on religion and international relations. Today, we're going to discuss the book of Michael Driessen, The Global Politics of Interreligious Dialogue, Religious Change, Citizenship and Solidarity in the Middle East. It was published by Oxford University Press in 2023. We have three distinguished panelists or respondents to the book. Petr Kratochvíl from the Institute of International Relations in Prague, Turan Kayaoğlu from the University of Colorado, Denver, and Nukhet Sandal from Ohio University. So each of them will engage with Michael Driessen's book after we give him the floor for 10-15 minutes to present his publication. So Michael, you have the floor for 10-15 minutes.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Thanks so much, Jocelyne, for the introduction, and thanks to ISA for the organization, but especially thanks to this panel of experts. It's a humbling experience to have a group of scholars who you esteem to read your book. So I'm very grateful for that and looking forward to the conversation. So I'll just give a brief introduction to some of the major themes here of the book, and then look forward to the debate and dialogue with the others here in the panel. So this book explores the rise of what I call state-sponsored interreligious dialogue initiatives in the broader Middle East region. Over the last 15 years, we've seen growth of a range of state-based initiatives in favor of religious tolerance and interreligious or intercultural dialogue. We have the creation of centers like Qaisid in Saudi Arabia, DSEED in Doha, the Abu Dhabi Forum for Peace, and declarations like the Human Fraternity Document, the Marrakesh Declaration, and the Common Word Letter. And when I first started this project, it seemed clear to me that these initiatives represented a new kind of institutional strategy that was being adopted by state and international actors to formally engage with religious communities in the region. At the same time, it was clear to me that these initiatives were connected to broader impulse to these initiatives, but they also seemed to have developed over time genuine religious and political content, and they were drawing on new social practices and aspirations to do so. So in order to make sense of these multiple layers, the book builds a theoretical framework with three levels of analysis focused on considerations of political power, ideas, and practices at work in these initiatives. These three dimensions are sometimes in tension with one another, but they're also inevitably connected. And one of the ways in which I see them connected is that all three can be linked somehow to the evolving response by multiple actors to ongoing crises of liberal democracy and the liberal international system which they had constructed. These crises have provoked what is often tagged in our field as new post-secular thinking about the role of religion in politics and new post-secular accounts of global politics, which the book draws on in its theoretical framework. In adopting this approach, one of my goals has been to place the growth of interreligious dialogue in the region within larger processes of global religious change. Within this perspective, the recent evolution of dialogue in the Middle East can be seen to be not unique to Islam, but rather part of a global religious development in response to globally experienced dynamics of modernity. So that's a little bit about the broader research project. Let me now say something about the first layer of analysis in my framework, which is that of geopolitics. In political science, recent work on interreligious initiatives in the region have been especially focused on questions about state interests and power dynamics, which seem to be driving these initiatives forward. And in fact, the growth of state-sponsored dialogue initiatives in the region could be seen as a concrete attempt by policymakers to craft a new relationship with religious actors and communities, both on account of perceived security threats having to do with religion in a post-9/11, post-ISIS world, but also at the same time, a growing acceptance of the position that directly engaging with religious actors was necessary somehow for the achievement of a range of political and humanitarian goals, whether that be on the environment, conflict mediation, or immigration. In a number of these accounts, the growth of interreligious dialogue can be seen as a result of the broader impulse of the modern nation state to manage, domesticate, and control religion and other social forces. We're very much in the realm of what Elizabeth Shackman Hurd calls the big R religion problem. Through interreligious dialogue, states and international organizations have begun to construct what might be dubbed as a global religious engagement regime, which legitimizes and establishes certain religious authorities and certain religious narratives while simultaneously excluding and delegitimizing others. For the United States and Europe and a number of international organizations, these interreligious initiatives and the formalization of policy positions which has gone along with it have served as a sort of pseudo-ministry of religious affairs for the international system. For regimes in the region, these dialogue initiatives have also been useful for states to maintain, manage, and promote certain religious authorities and narratives, but also, as Peter Manderville and Shadi Hamid's work argues, to utilize religion as a form of statecraft, to accumulate soft power and extend geopolitical competition. Qatar and the UAE are important examples here. Now, this strategic logic has led to a certain skepticism of interreligious engagement. It's a worry that it is or has been easily instrumentalized by state actors to manage religious actors and religious communities and vice versa. And we have this common epithet that you hear that these interreligious initiatives simply function as a form of religion washing. Now, I think that this argument is important, but also insufficient, and that by itself, the bare bones geopolitical analysis misses other dimensions at work in these initiatives, including the political and religious ideas which they bring forward. So we have to dig further into the substrata. I live in the Mediterranean. It's all about the substrata here. And here I detect, especially over the arc of recent declarations in the region, elements of what I argue is part of a longer effort within Islam and other global religious traditions to respond to processes of modernization and all that that has entailed: democratization, globalization, secularization, and so forth. So there's a long-run religious development at work here, which has been pushed forward in important ways by the experience of violence, but also by democratic developments within Middle East societies themselves. Here, I think Asif Bayat's work on the emergence of a post-Islamist sensibility in the region remains important in this regard. And in the book, I focus especially on the development within these declarations and initiatives of citizenship narratives, what is often referred to as inclusive citizenship within these declarations, and what I refer to as the dignity, freedom, citizenship principle, which seems to emerge from them. This principle has been increasingly articulated and embraced by a number of theologians and religious actors, and consistently shows up in progressive development across these declarations. In the book, I trace the idea through the Amman Message, Common Word Letter, the Marrakesh Declaration, a series of Al-Azhar statements last decade, and the Human Fraternity document, among others. And one of the things I find interesting is how much this idea of inclusive, or what sometimes is referred to as active or full or comprehensive citizenship, has been embraced within recent and religious initiatives in the Middle East as the solution to religious and political crises and religious pluralism. Faced with the question of violence against religious minorities, of religious and political instability and conflict, the strengthening of citizenship rights and support for citizenship formation has often been posed as the answer, as a strong model of political and religious development which responds to those crises. In important ways, therefore, I read this body of actions and movements and ideas as striving to construct a credible and alternative vision of religious modernity. And in the book, I explore some parallels with the Catholic world, which I think offers interesting perspective on that construction. In this light, interreligious dialogue efforts in the region represent a breakthrough. They've helped liberate religious authorities to reclaim a positive public religious role in their support for citizen rights and religious reform. Now, part of the enthusiasm within official Islam today for dialogue and multi-religious cooperation, I think, must be understood within this perspective, as perceived to be consonant with a project of religious renewal, one which does not threaten, but may even strengthen orthodox religious moral sensibilities within society. And I find something distinctively post-secular about this term, the rediscovery of a great necessary role for religion in post-modernity, as the original grounding for the rights and freedom and pluralism that moderns hold dear. And I think you can see this especially with the use and development of the term human fraternity, or as often has been posed within these declarations, of social cohesion. Solidarity within these initiatives is often argued to be the necessary flip side to freedom and diversity, and religion is proposed as offering a source for regenerating that solidarity. And this is a classic position which we can find within the sociology of religion, stretching back to Durkheim. And in this respect, these religious actors and intellectuals are clearly making an argument that political crises in the region and political crises globally represent a religious crisis, and therefore that political renewal requires religious renewal and the strengthening of religion's role and space in the public sphere. And that raises a number of interesting ambiguities, which characterize not just these dialogue initiatives, but I think a whole range of contemporary religious political projects, which also propose to rebuild public religious dynamics as a means to recreating a stronger moral foundation for exercising human rights and freedoms in politics. My colleague Christina Stoichel has captured this tension in what she refers to as the rediscovery of Article 29 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, especially by the Russian Orthodox Church, which is her purview, but also other conservative religious traditions across the globe. Article 29 includes a line about the duties of individuals to their community and the limitations to freedom set by the just requirements of morality and public order. In my book, I document a number of religious leaders in the Middle East who have also rediscovered Article 29. In doing so, their support for inclusive citizenship and religious freedom is coupled with strong emphasis on duties and responsibilities and the role played by the state and religious authorities in generating political virtues and social cohesion. Few of these declarations, it should be noted, particularly those emanating from the Middle East, mention democracy or recommend limits on state power. Now, by naming these tensions, I don't want to argue that this ambivalence is necessarily debilitating. The declarations do not condemn democracy, and they're designed to orient diverse societies towards common ideals on citizenship, pluralism, and freedom, and to motivate international cooperation on that basis. In doing so, I think these declarations have facilitated broader efforts by religious traditions to come to terms with late modernity in ways which preserve a strong religious account of society and politics, while also promoting human rights and freedoms. As I conclude in the book, the future of interreligious dialogue in the region remains unclear, even more so today given the tragic new violence in the region. Whatever its future may be, however, these initiatives, I think, represent an important stage in the global development of religion in late modernity and in international relations, and I think they should continue to require our research attentions and efforts. And I'll stop there for time and pass over to the others for conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. The floor is to Petr Kratochvíl.
Thank you very much, dear Jocelyne. Well, it is of course an honor for me to speak in this roundtable and discuss a book that I read with one breath, as we say in my mother tongue. Well, there is a long list of reasons why anyone interested in religion and global politics should read this book, but I want to highlight just 3 of those reasons. First, as I wrote in my recent study in International Studies Review, if you look at the academic articles published in the last 10 years about Islam and politics, still around 80% of those focus on the negative aspects of Islam and on conflict. And this book presents a very different picture and does so exceedingly well. And this alone, I think, makes the book worth reading. Secondly, the study is obviously heavily focused on the Islamic world, but the theoretical chapters, which constitute almost 2/3 of the study, are useful for anyone interested in the global resurgence of religion. And I believe there are very few studies out there that have succeeded in so organically connecting the disparate discussions about the new axial age, post-secularism, and multiple modernities as this book has done. I really enjoyed reading the theoretical part. And the third thing that I really like about the book is that it skillfully avoids the trap of an either-or. So either the success of the interreligious dialogue in the Middle East is due to a religious resurgence, or it is a consequence of the state supreme argument, so instrumentalization of religion, essentially. And Michael demonstrates how these two elements intertwine in all those 4 case studies differently, but also how they produce new unexpected outcomes that also tell us a lot about how religious communities respond to the challenges of modernization. And the possibility of a religious modernity is obviously the key underlying theme here, and one that is fascinating, at least for me, and I hope for many others as well. So congratulations on that. I found that really great too. I really enjoyed reading it. But of course, there are elements and arguments where I was not entirely convinced, as is always the case, and where I would love to hear more from Michael. And I would like to mention perhaps 2 of those, and perhaps then we can come to others in the discussion. Now, first, the discussion about exclusivism, inclusivism, and pluralism, which is a central argument of the study. The study makes a subtle and nuanced claim that what we are seeing at the moment is an axial breakthrough, a dramatic, if incomplete, shift in thinking about religious truth from exclusivism via inclusivism to pluralism. And the study uses the Catholic shift at the Second Vatican Council as a historical example, and to some extent also as a template. And as Christianity and global politics is my own research area, I enjoyed reading about that connection that you make there. But you also argue, or the study also argues, that that what the study describes here and in relation to Islam is part of a global religious shift, right? So you make a broader argument, not only that there is a shift, an axial paradigmatic shift within the Islamic world or within the Catholic Church, but that it's an example of a broader trend. And I really wonder whether that really is the case, especially when talking about the current Catholic Church and the evolution within the current Catholic Church. Now, I would argue that what happened at the Second Vatican Council was essentially an embrace of inclusivism, but certainly not pluralism. And even after the council, the Church refused and continues to refuse to join ecumenical bodies, such as the World Council of Churches or the Conference of European Churches, the ecumenical movement where I am personally also heavily engaged and invested in. But the problem for me is even deeper, and that is that what we have recently seen, especially with Benedict XVI, but also with the growing opposition to Pope Francis, is a reversal of the trend, a certain backsliding towards exclusivism. And a similar trend is visible in the ecumenical movement beyond the Catholic Church, with an intensifying struggle between the exclusivist and inclusivist position, not to speak about pluralism at all. So pluralism essentially is nowhere to be seen in global Christianity, I would argue today, either in terms of the political steps by the religious leaders or in terms of the positions of ordinary believers. And instead, what I see there is a general retreat and weakening of the ecumenical movement and inter-Christian dialogue. And many would even argue that what we are seeing is the most serious crisis of the ecumenical movement there. So in a sense, the argument that the new axial age is bringing a new pluralist self-understanding of religious actors is increasingly contested, I would say, or even under a heavy attack. So this, I would say, calls forth the question about whether what we see in the Middle East and the case studies that you so well describe is an exception from a global trend, or whether the backlash that we see within Christianity is a deviation from the general trend. Or perhaps my reading of the Christian situation may be mistaken, right? So I would like to hear more about that. And the second point I want to make is related to the distinction or classification used or introduced by Elizabeth Chapman-Hurt, where she speaks about expert, governed, and lived religion, right? I'm sure you are familiar with the distinction. And I would say that the study is really strong in terms of expert religion. So the analysis of interreligious dialogue as seen by the experts or by people from the academia, yourself included, obviously. It is also strong, I would argue, as far as governed religion is concerned. So interreligious dialogue as defined by those in positions of power, be it those leaders of state, secular power, or religious leaders. But thirdly, there is the question of lived religion. And now, of course, you could easily argue that you have these two case studies, Focolare in Algeria and the Adyan Foundation Lebanon, and both of those are examples of lived religion. But still, both of these are very specific actors and relatively small ones. So I wonder in how far you would be prepared to extend your analysis and perhaps more importantly, also your conclusions about the increasing pluralism in the Islamic world to the views and also political behavior by ordinary believers in these countries. So it seems to me that what the case studies describe are in all four cases still examples of elite religion. So either experts or those governing or those living in unique, very specific communities. So what about the masses? Is a similar trend observable there? And if yes or not, no, what are the consequences then? So that's the second point. I have a long list of other things that I'd love to discuss with you. But again, let me conclude my introductory remarks by saying that this is an excellent study that I really enjoyed reading and which I believe and hope will soon become a seminal work on interreligious dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you, Petr. Before I give the floor to Turan, I want to inform our audience that they can raise their hand and ask questions when the Q&A comes, or they can also write their question in the Q&A boxes that they can see at the bottom of their screen. Both ways are acceptable. Turan, please.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you also inviting me to this discussion. I'm looking forward to the engagement. Kind of a couple of things in terms of to kind of help you to frame where I'm coming from about some of my comments. I want to kind of tell a little bit about my own positionality. I define myself as, for now, American Muslim of Turkish origin. And I have kind of work and write on issues about interfaith, interreligious dialogue over, I think, 10, 15 years. And I also did practice some forms of interfaith dialogue and interreligious engagement as in American Muslim context, dealing with maybe American kind of Christians or American Jews. I have particularly invested quite a bit of time about the dialogue between American Muslims and American Jews. And when I was kind of at this impressive book, I really enjoyed the interdisciplinary area of scholarship that you bring from not only from political science, but religious studies, history, comparative religion, kind of the philosophy. I was kind of amazed about the interdisciplinary breadth, and I really enjoy that. I felt that the framework that I'm in the book, and I will continue to advocate that, is essentially a political frame. And I think over the time, my understanding or my approach to interreligious dialogue and interfaith dialogue kind of evolved to be a little bit more sympathetic, to much more critical and skeptical kind of perspective. I'm not a cynic yet, but I want to ask us to kind of think a little bit more kind of skeptically. I will say that any interfaith or interreligious dialogue that is beyond your neighborhood-friendly imam, priest, and rabbi are getting together, talking about their neighborhood issues. Anything beyond that for any national and international actor engaging interreligious dialogue, I will say that it's driven by mostly, in some cases, exclusively political interest. And my kind of the questions and my kind of the comments, I will kind of try to kind of to force that particular kind of the perspective. I will kind of frame my kind of the comments in three questions. One is that and I will post them in the chat as well. One is that I want to kind of ask whether that the frame that you are asking us to think about interreligious dialogue, particularly post-Islamism and post-secularism, are the right frames. I admire Habermas and Bayat's work. They are definitely kind of challenge us to think about philosophical, intellectual, futuristic possibilities. But I kind of felt that kind of taking such a kind of the framework from narrowly defined philosophical and intellectual environment and try to kind of explain a global kind of the activities of interreligious kind of dialogue may be kind of the misapplying the kind of the framework. It allows, of course, to think about us about the future possibilities, but I'm also, I think, being a little more kind of skeptical. I'm also getting a little more skeptical about us as social scientists to understand what's going to happen 100 years from now. It allows a bit more long-termism, and again, just allow you to say some about the possibilities, but again, it may not necessarily for me capture what I see interreligious dialogue activities, political framework and other captures much better. To build on that, I will say that my second question is that as we are kind of thinking about these possibilities, whether there are some definitional and case selection issues are built into that. I felt that your definition of interreligious dialogue is fairly neutral. It doesn't necessarily involve a normative framework, but your broader discussion, it just definitely put it in a progressive, emancipatory framework, kind of talking about, and your case studies help with that, much more democratic, expanding the citizenship, emancipatory kind of the framework. One of my identities, at least until last month, was an elected official in United States. I serve on a school board. And I was kind of amazed how that I'm getting very similar emails from evangelical Christians and from conservative Muslims about their fears about the LGBTQ kind of the rights. And increasingly what I'm seeing is that the evangelical Christian discourse about that and that the conservative Muslim discourse are kind of converging. And it's not going to surprise me that these people are actually talking to each other, learning from each other, kind of feed into each other's anti-LGBTQ kind of the sentiments. Just kind of thinking about the American politics, I kind of see that such a kind of the convergence may have kind of quite with political implications as we are into a presidential cycle. But my broader question is this, is that if a group of Christians and Muslims get together and talk and they kind of converge about a pro-LGBTQ agenda, I think your framework nicely captured that. But if they converge into anti-LGBTQ agenda, you will have a kind of a hard time to kind of capture that. And when I kind of think about the politics, I see more of the later, lots of convergence on a particular social conservative agendas among the religious actors and religious conservative people, as opposed to emancipatory kind of the framework. I'm not necessarily sure how that kind of reflect onto kind of the middle kind of the space, but again, since your framework also, as Peter nicely said, kind of has kind of theoretical underpinnings, I want to bring that to the table. And then the third issue I want to bring is that, as I mentioned, I invested quite a bit time about American Jewish and American Muslim dialogue, an issue that I cannot talk comfortably now, because I kind of feel that if I kind of talk, I kind of either alienate and just kind of establish quite a bit break between my American Muslim communities. And if I cannot talk in some ways, I will definitely establish some breaks with the American Jewish communities. And it asks me this question is that why is it so difficult to be able to have a sustained engagement, interreligious engagement between American Muslims and American Jews, which in not all, but in many respects, kind of share similar positionality in American politics as religious kind of the minorities. And in terms of theology, there are many more commonalities between Judaism and Islam compared to, let's say, the other kind of faith traditions. But then again, it's just kind of very, very difficult. And their difficulty is not that they are not interested in, the difficulty is that the broader political framework is not going to be able to allow any meaningful, sustained kind of dialogue between them. All this kind of tells me either about the, post-Islamism, post-secularism are good frameworks, but it allows to discount the actual politics kind of happening, we need to be kind of cautious. And the progressive bias may kind of lead us to see some political engagements, some interreligious activities, not the others. I kind of ask to be cautious about that. And then the third for me is, and as an American Muslim, just kind of my inability to engage in a meaningful interreligious dialogue in this political climate, because something happens in Middle East has kind of repercussions, tells me political framework are good us to still consider as core frameworks. I'm looking forward to engagement. And again, thank you, Michael, for the book.
Thank you, Turan. And Nukhet, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jocelyne, and thank you so much, Michael, again, for inviting me to this discussion. Your book was already on my to-read list, but this gave me a push to just finish it in time and critically reflect on it. So Michael did not, of course, have the time, but also he is very humble, so he did not mention the extensive field research he has done for this book, which I would say is like, I was really impressed, and I love reading books that include so many interviews and personal interactions. So I learned a lot. Just to give a quick sense to folks who haven't had a chance to read the book yet, he says that over a 5-year period from 2014 to 2019, he has conducted multiple short trips to Egypt, Jordan, UAE, Austria, and Qatar, and longer stays in Algeria and Lebanon, and conducted 153 face-to-face interviews. So, and when you look at the case studies, you see the richness and the sophistication of this type of research, and I really especially learned from those chapters. So like Turan said, I will also a little bit talk about my own background. I am also an American of Turkish origin, and I have conducted extensive research on Northern Ireland, especially in the context of interfaith, well, let's call it interfaith because it's not necessarily interreligious. And I continue to study Turkey and religion and politics within the context of the Middle East. So like Petr and Turan, I have a long list of questions I wish we could discuss for 10 hours, maybe over some wine. But I will just summarize the main points of interest to me, and maybe we will have time to engage. Maybe, Michael, you will have time to engage those, but if not, I would look forward to some follow-up conversations. So my first one is, I'm really fascinated by how these initiatives interact with the role conceptions, political role conceptions of the states, especially in the post-Cold War world. You talked about the religion washing, which is really a fascinating term. For example, for Turkey, I recently completed a project where I looked at trying to navigate the Muslim leadership identity and discourse, whereas keeping the NATO identity. So what are some roles that can accommodate both of these identities? Well, mediator or conflict resolution or this interreligious, and that interreligious discourse within the context of Turkey has not ended yet. It continues. I mean, there are like ups and downs of it, but that gave Turkey a convenient identity given these conflicting role conceptions. Same with Qatar, right? I mean, you have the Muslim Brotherhood background coming up sometimes, and you need a more neutral identity if possible. So some of these interreligious or mediator positions, how much of it, and I share Turan's perspective a little bit, like I see those as more instrumental political moves that will help these states justify their influence in the system. So I would be more interested in hearing about that. And also, in the book, you make multiple references to Gülen community Hizmet movement, which actually led this interreligious conversations for some time and probably still leading. But I am also interested in your views about how does that fit into like Turkish state discourse on interreligious, and then you come down really hard on this group that actually spearheaded these conversations. So you see this like state identity in a way oppressing or trying to exclude that discourse, which once, it was intertwined. I remember when I first started my graduate studies in California, I went to a Turkish festival, which was like thousands of dollars. Actually, it was hundreds of thousands of dollars were spent on that. And it was Turkish like state and Gülen community together, Hizmet movement together organized it. So from those days of interreligious discourse, interfaith dialogue, to today's world where Hizmet movement has been declared a terrorist organization by the Turkish state. And another interesting point there is I'm also interested in rise of like Christians and Jews in Turkey. And I have again recently completed the study with my colleague Erdi Öztürk. So we did lots of interviews, and some of the interviews are interviewees who were Christians mostly said that now that there is the Gülen community and the Kurds who are the enemies in quotes, Christian and Jewish identity is mostly desecuritized. So the government has been much more receptive to this Muslim-Christian type of understanding and discourse because Christians are not seen as the other as much as the new others anymore. So that was an interesting dynamic that may be interesting to explore more. Another, my third, I have 5 points. My third question was, do these, and you mentioned this, I think there's a quote by Mekia Neccar. It is said that Christian theology is not the same since the Holocaust, and indeed Muslim theology is not the same since 9/11. So for these inclusivist interpretations to come up, do we need always like an exclusive other so that the inclusive ones will step up and say, this is not about that only, right? So I saw, that's my argument actually in my book about Northern Ireland. Initially in 1960s, you wouldn't see politicians or even mainstream religious leaders talking about conflict resolution. But then you had Ian Paisley, who with his really radical evangelical discourse tried to occupy that space with aggressive statements. And then mainstream religious leaders who once said that this political situation has nothing to do with religion started to change their tone, and they tried to balance that aggressive Paisley discourse. So are these reactions to certain dynamics? And in some parts in the book, you mentioned that they are related, but I was wondering whether we can have even like a tentative causal relationship that when there are more exclusive statements, then the moderates will need to come up with some sort of discourse. The folklore is fascinating. I mean, I had heard of it, but I didn't have a chance to read more about that. And then you talk about like how like they are in Turkey too, and someone experienced this in Turkey, and then they went to Algeria. So I mean, I would love to hear more about that. It was really amazing. And the more I read about that, I was thinking whether a theology can exist outside of belonging to one religion. Because in certain parts you mentioned, there are multiple quotes like this is the kind of spiritual interior experience I wanted to have, and I could not find that experience in the practice of Christianity or Islam. And this is something that blends things together and makes a consistent whole. And certain parts, it made me think maybe this is the new theology or theological approach that is not Muslim or Christian by itself, and that doesn't exclude those identities. You can be Muslim and, also be practicing this type of theology. But maybe, I mean, it's not an appropriate perspective, but it made me think about that. And to my final point, just to close the first round, So you have also close links to Adyan Foundation, Adyan, right? And it was also a fascinating topic to read about. And one thing I'm really curious there, since you have so much experience, not just within the context of the book, but I think you serve as a consultant for them, advisor for them as well. So how do they navigate the sectarian politics of Lebanon? And you talk about like they're also close to Hezbollah circles and Fadlallah. So as you try to do things and more active, as you become more active in the public sphere, don't they draw the ire of certain interest circles, be it, you know, the Shia or the Sunni groups? How do they deal with that in a highly polarized environment where, I mean, access to services has been a big challenge so far? So governance is really weak. There are multiple problems. So I would imagine that not everybody would be very happy about their existence or the links they are forming, and they would question, oh, you know, they are close to these circles. There must be Iran, there must be Saudi Arabia, someone funding there. So I would love to hear more about those details within the context of Adyan. Again, I can continue for half more hour, but I will stop here. Thank you so much, Michael. This really gave me a lot of food for thought. And I highly recommend the book to everyone who is interested in both first-hand accounts of experience with these organizations, but also have a review of what is going on. I mean, I consider myself pretty well-read on interreligious, interfaith dialogue, but I learned a lot. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you, Nukhet. So, Michael, I give you the floor if you want to address some of the points. I have some of my own, but let's go, I mean, let's give a and go back to you. And for the second round, I may have a few comments. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. So lots of comments, and thank you. It's really it's a treat to have somebody engage with your thinking. So let me try to respond to a few of these. I won't be able to get to all of them, but let me just try to pick up on a few of these points. First, maybe to Peter on very well taken questions here on potential backsliding, this question between pluralism, inclusivism, and exclusivism. Let me just say one thing about that. In the book, and want to be careful here, in the book, I don't think that the actual shift is necessarily to a type of pluralism where all belief systems and theologies are equal type of a pluralism. I actually think that what we see most emerging is a kind of inclusivism, which sees positive valence within plurality, and that can go in different directions. So I don't, and maybe this didn't come off as well, but I don't think that the predominant shift is to pluralism tout court, sort of, the pluralism of a Hans Kung. I think you're absolutely right within the Catholic Church, but also within the groups that I'm looking at within the Middle East and the declarations, they cannot be described as pluralism. What they can be described as is seeing positive valence in the other and recognizing a spiritual and theological legitimacy to others. So that's a big shift away from exclusivism. And I think it's new. I think it's part of this new interreligious dialogue, global interreligious dialogue movement, but is also somehow interacting with modernity. That inclusivism, however, which I try to also articulate, it creates it creates tensions and ambivalence. And I try to, as I emphasized in the presentation a little bit, but with this Article 29, which I think is really interesting, the way in which, and you see this within the Russian Orthodox Church, which it's so interesting that you see they have picked it up word for word within a number of these declarations as well, that Article 29 of that of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights gives cover for or unleashes or liberates a really strong religious message, right? So it's within these interreligious dialogue movements, it's pushing for a positive valence of the religious other, but it's also reestablishing, reaffirming the centrality of religion within the public sphere. And I think that centrality should be seen as within, I think, more the inclusivist stage. But I think inclusivism itself is sort of limited within that. So that means that depending on the context and depending on how it is further developed, because it's ambivalent, it can go in a more conservative direction, it can go in a more liberal direction. And so you see the Russian Orthodox Church. I think Stoikal's work is very interesting. I think earlier versions of her work were much more saw that articulation as potentially moving towards a more liberal understanding from within the Russian Orthodox Church. That was one possibility, but it didn't go in that direction, obviously. And so you also have this more conservative possibility. And I see that certainly within these declarations as well. Sheikh Abdullah bin Baya, who I spent quite a bit of time looking at, I think he's very ambivalent about, where the further development of bin Baya's thought. He's elderly now, but those who take over his thought, I think it's not clear. He can easily be used for very conservative arguments as well. So, so the inclusivism, the seeing of the other as seen of plurality as a good, doesn't necessarily mean progressive and liberal. It can also mean, it can also be a conservative, a deeply conservative position as well. So that's one thing. Maybe just one thing on the lived religion. It's true. I would say that obviously my attempts to get at some of that lived religion was within by looking at these case studies. So Nukhet was talking about Adiane and Focolare. They're small, limited groups, right? So this is clear. One of the things that I'm trying to do to bring this research forward is to chart out pluralism as an attitude within Middle East societies, more from statistical take. So looking at different dimensions of religious pluralism, how that's viewed within society. I'm hoping that will help me get at some of this. How much of this is also being reflecting shifts within society. And we'll see. We'll see how much echo it has and how much how much limited it is. But let me use that as a bridge to one of at least one of Turan's wonderful points. Thank you so much, Turan. Lots of food for thought here. But maybe just one thing on post-Islamism and Asaf Bayat's work here. I do continue to think, and this is connecting also to Peter's question about the lived religion or how much of this is coming from within societies. Even if we don't see mass-based interreligious dialogue as a movement, right, within these societies, although you have elements of it in some places. I mean, Gulen, I'll get to Gulen in a little bit. Gulen was certainly represented that on some level. Another one of our ongoing research projects, is looking in Indonesia, particularly at the role that interreligious dialogue is playing within movements like Nahdlatul Ulama and Muhammadiyah, where there's an important aspect there as well. But within the idea, the framework of post-Islamism, I think one of the useful things is that it does recognize this still present within Middle Eastern societies, this shift towards positive attitudes towards democracy. So that's not necessarily dialogue, but I think there's a connection there. I think that the dialogue is also responding to that. I really see, particularly within these dialogue initiatives, leaders like Sheikh bin Baya and others responding to the social aspirations which were emanating from the Arab Spring, and which Bayat, I think, really captures well. So the dialogue, that these declarations are also a response to that. Some people argue they're a counter-revolutionary response, or sort of keeping away further change by recognizing religious pluralism, recognizing religious freedom, really pumping up discourses on citizenship. But I think that they are directly respond to those shifts. So the long-term democratization of attitudes within society, even if that's not at the institutional level, I think is certainly driving these initiatives. So I agree with you. The political context is key. Much of this is being pushed forward through the geopolitical context of the region, state interests, especially at the expert level. But through the use of post-secularism and post-Islamism, I wanted to try to get at some of those social shifts that were also happening underneath it, the long-run social shifts, but I think also need to be present. On the question of progressive, conservative, I've tried to say a little bit about how I think this can also be, conservatism. No group, I'm not as familiar with interreligious dialogue in the United States. So, but no group that I looked at had any pro-LGBT, message. So none of these dialogue, even the most progressive ones, within the Middle East generally stayed away from that because of how difficult it was to speak about that within the context of that. But one of the things I find still so interested is how over the last 15 years, you do have very, again, I'll use this term, conservative religious leaders within the Middle East who sort of have a change of perspective on pluralism. So in the chapter on Qaisid in Saudi Arabia, I think that comes out quite a bit. They remain conservative Muslim scholars, fiqh sort of jurisprudence scholars, but 15 years ago, they completely rejected dialogue as a position, and now they're participating in them. So it may be a small change, but I think it's a significant change. And again, not necessarily a progressive change in the sense of the progressivism which we refer to in the United States, but progressive in this, or shift in the sense of moving more towards a positive view on plurality, which I think is significant. Very interesting comments on American Muslim and Jewish dialogue. The book wasn't about what didn't concentrate on Muslim-Jewish dialogue, but I think it's very important. If we have time, we can come back to a question on the Abraham Accords, where I think it does play a very important role, also within my book. For time's sake, I'm going to move to a couple of points from Nukhet. Thank you very much. Very interesting questions all around. This idea of roles, I think, is nice, and I think you're right. I agree with that. That on one level, if we look at just the instrumental use of interreligious dialogue, which is an important dimension of the theory, it plays a useful role. It really does allow Qatar or the UAE to unlock certain quandaries. They can project themselves as fully Muslim, but at the same time, pursuing a human rights agenda, and at the same time, really keeping on to their traditions and to their within society. So I think that's right. I think it's a key. It's a really interesting key, which enables them to go from which I think was 10 years of a very defensive posture within the region, always constantly having to defend Islam from accusations of violence and whatever it was. This enabled them to move on the offensive, so to speak, take a positive, it's a flip of a switch in some ways. We are proposing that Islam is needed somehow, that religious renewal is needed for you liberal democracies in the West, which are having this major crisis. You don't have solidarity, you don't have all sorts of things. We offer something to that. We offer a way to deeper foundations maybe for human rights, which you need to remember on something. So I think it's that shift, I think, is a very important aspect of this. Gulen, yes, Gulen is certainly very important and was so key in so many. I mean, Turan's the right person to ask this to, who wrote a lot on this, in the early 2010s, that we're an avatar for not only for interreligious dialogue, but also for the type of Muslim democracy that people were hoping was sort of happening or being created in Turkey in the early 2000s. And that body of work, I think, remains important, even if things fell apart and you have this have this conflict. And among a lot of the dialogue scholars, they still refer to a number of those different ideas and to the development of that connection, which I think is is very important. Part of my attempt here was to look at where the center of gravity shifted afterwards. So why, how places like Saudi Arabia and Qatar and others sort of took up that discourse and pushed it into different ways. But I also think that it's, and I try to do this in the book, and maybe it didn't come out as much. I think it's also necessary to look at the failure of that project on some level. Turkey, as you said, criminalized Gulen, and I think Turan, I could say much more here, but has, largely, even though dialogue is still there, as you say, but it's nowhere near what it was 15 years ago. So I mean, and very problematic. It's seen as problematic as a place of foreign imposition or as a foreign intervention, among other things. It's still there, but it's there's a hostile stance towards interreligious dialogue that is that has crept up. And so we know that states can shift that discourse over time. And that raises questions about the future of dialogue in places like Qatar and Saudi Arabia. Will Mohammed bin Salman decide that this is no longer useful, given the context of Israel? I think this speaks to Turan's point, and shut that down. I think that's a possibility that we need to think about. Two small little notes, and then I'll send it back to Jocelyne, just because these were so rich. Yes, on Northern Ireland, thanks so much for bringing that up. It's a really nice connection. I do think, and maybe my recent thinking, this has come out even more so, the development of interreligious dialogue in multiple locations is somehow connected to experiences of violence. We really can't think about dialogue, but also democracy in the Christian Catholic context in the 1960s without understanding the mega violence of World War II. That's the foundation. If it had not been for that violence, I don't think the Catholic Church would have democratized. I think their preference through World War II was really for a more conservative authoritarian government. And if they would have gotten, so they were pushed on some level for a number of different reasons. It wasn't the only thing, but they were certainly pushed to stake out a different position and to use other resources which were there. And I think I need to be careful. We need to be careful about retrofitting or, these comparisons can, I don't want to put, you work on both Christianity and Islam. So we want to be careful to assume that that's what Islam is doing. But I do think that this dialogue, the interreligious dialogue movements, which I describe in the book, cannot be fully understood without reference to 9/11 and the Islamic State. And that quote I thought was really pregnant with meaning in that sense. But not just violence. I think there's also other things going on. Again, both the Islamic State and the Arab Spring. You have to understand, both of those things going on at the same time. They're developing together somehow. And that was also the Christian experience. There was also a pre-World War II, pre-World War I democratic Christian thought, which was already developing, and it was sort of ripe at was ripe to be used at the time of after World War II. Maybe just final thing on the Adyan Foundation. Yes, that's a very difficult task for them to navigate those dynamics, and the more in which they have become prevalent in the public sphere, the more in which that has become difficult. So, your intuition is correct. The more in which, but that said, they have done something, I think, which is unusual. And I think interreligious dialogue, again, shows its sort of usefulness, if we can use that term, not necessarily in the instrumental sense, but the way in which they have avoided being pegged as secular or liberal or being bought by outside. They've always been very clear about their public religious project, that this is for the good of religion itself. They're not trying to instrument, and I think that has given them an enormous legitimization. And they have really sought out friendship with religious leaders in different religious traditions. And that's also been, they built up relationships for 10 years with really high-placed sheikhs and imams and theological institutes, in which they bought credibility. That credibility, I think, over time, as they become more relevant, and the protests following the explosion, the youth protests following the explosion over the last couple of years, which they participated more openly in, has somewhat changed their position in that sense, because of how they became much more identified with that civil society movement. Love to talk more about the focolari because they're super fascinating, and your comments are very relevant. But I want to open up to other questions as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. While we are waiting for feedback or question from the audience, allow me to say a few things. First, I would like to second the praise you got from our colleagues. It's, I think, one of the first books that does a systematic work to map what is going on in this world of interreligious dialogue and the empirical work you did. So it does give a very lively flesh and blood approach to interreligious dialogue. I am intrigued by the position. I'm going to take it from your position that came in your presentation, and I didn't hear lots of questions on that, on pushing toward democracy, or this way of doing interreligious dialogue that is a way to move toward democracy. I have doubt about that, lots of doubts, for multiple reasons. The first one is that first, the civil societies, when they can breathe in lots of these Muslim countries, are more open than we think they are. Through my own empirical work, through lots of surveys that exist, there was the inclusiveness is not articulated or framed this way, but it's what we call sometimes, religious competency of people. And it doesn't show up at the level automatically of the public positions. And we should not underestimate that in the sense that the maturity of citizens on the ground was already there, and that this interreligious initiative doesn't automatically mean that they are the lead. In my opinion, they are behind, and they are taking advantage of that. And in this regard, everybody mentioned 9/11 as a shift, and the Arab Spring, and you show this pretty well in the book. So there is a need to posit Muslim countries, especially from the point of view of their leaders, in a more inclusive way. But that's why they are tapping into initiatives that may already be there. And in here, I joined Turan. I'm not sure that post-secularism is the best angle to look at that. My own take would be more governmentality in the Foucault sense, in the sense that we are witnessing here a connection between state action and some segment of the society, but at the end of the day, it's for the sake of maintaining the state power here, and not really allowing for real inclusiveness or democratization. And again, because most of these states you mentioned, they are what I call hegemonic Islam state, where Islam is part of the dominant culture, even if you are not a Muslim. So what's happening in this new phase is trying to tap into people who mean well. Sheikh Ben Baya, he means very well, but I'm not sure that the outcome of what the state is positing itself on the Declaration of Marrakesh on minorities is really in the sense of pushing toward inclusion on the ground. I am not convinced by that. And that's what I would call this governmentality, in the sense that it doesn't change much of the status quo. So I stop here. If you want to respond to that.
Sure, just brief response to that, and then allow others as well. But yeah, well, as I mentioned, in the presentation, I mean, and in some sense, I agree with you. Democracy is not the main aim of these declarations, particularly coming from Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar. They don't mention democracy ever, and in fact, in negotiations, that was very clear. This is not. So I would distinguish between in the declarations themselves and in the process, and then the intention of these regimes themselves is not democracy. It is tolerance, perhaps. But it is citizenship. So citizenship here doesn't mean necessarily democracy. Now they talk about inclusive citizenship, full citizenship. I think that creates contradictions. But your use of governmentality could be could well describe this. They want citizens who are actively participating in the life of the nation-building project, which they are. Tariq Masoud has this very nice piece on this on Saudi Arabia, sort of the modernization of Saudi Arabia, and the place that citizenship plays within that. And I think that somehow interreligious dialogue declarations are playing into that. They're trying to spur on, among other things, also this idea of citizens. We need citizens even within these authoritarian nations. Now, having said that, that creates tensions with the idea itself. So here's where I maybe push back. Not necessarily becoming democratic. I don't think that that's going to happen anytime soon in Qatar or Saudi Arabia, but they have been developing, or, you know, I think there's a progressive, coherent development within these declarations as well, of certain ideas which are theologically coherent ideas, hermeneutically coherent within the logic of Islamic theology. So, you know, the idea of religious freedom, I mean, an idea of religious freedom that emanates from these, I think, is powerful. The idea of religious legitimacy of others. The lengths to which these declarations go to say that religious minorities need to be protected within our societies, and giving a Quranic basis for that, I think, and also for citizenship itself, that citizenship is, you know, they've all sorts of these scholars have really pushed hard that this is an idea which is coherent within the long history of Islam, in the Medina Charter or whatever. So those ideas are out there. They're sort of out into the system and given legitimacy by these declarations themselves. And I think it's somewhat at odds with the authoritarian designs of these states. So I agree, there's an instrumental logic that the state is employing. It's looking for citizens who are inclusive and treat their neighbors well, but not necessarily democracy. But on the other hand, there's some development there which is being legitimized within society, and I'm interested to see what happens with that. I'm not totally sure. I would say in other places, and here context really makes a difference. In other places, the democratic element is much more central. So again, going back to the Indonesia, which is a project which I'm working on right now, in the humanitarian Islam, it's very explicit how they see their interreligious dialogue, or the push for interreligious dialogue and the push for human dignity and rights and religious freedom as connected to a democratic logic, that democracy within that requires those things, and that's coherent, again, consistent with an Islamic theological framework. They make direct, I'm very fascinated by this, and in fact, this is my next research project, but they make direct channels, they open direct channels to Christian democracy in doing so. So I think the Humanitarian Islam Project in particular recognizes themselves as being within a family of a philosophical religious family that we might refer to as religious humanism. And I think that's, and Gulen, I think, probably was as well, you know, at least philosophically could be understood within that project as well. So that remains there as a tradition, and I think that should not be forgotten within our debates as well. So I'll just say that.
I see that Dave had a question on the chat. I think he left, but so he's asking how Michael sees the demographic shift of Christianity and Islam outside of the Mediterranean region, loosely speaking, impacting the future of interreligious dialogue and its global foreign policy contexts.
Well, thanks, Dave. Who's gone? No, good question. Well, I have reflections on that. I'm not sure would be the first question, but I wonder if, on some level, interreligious dialogue or in these declarations is part of a wider global reflection on the role of religion and modernity. So that this is one of my sort of bigger thoughts that runs through the book, that this is part of a broader reflection on public religious engagement and religion's role in modernity. And I think they're reclaiming within the language, within the international language that we use within the international system on human rights, on religious freedom, on citizenship, they're reclaiming a central role for religion within that. So religion is a positive force for modernity. So that breaks with, I think, a more secular international discourse that modernization requires, you know, a much more secular public sphere, secular policymakers, and so on. So there's a reclaiming and a positive note of that central role of religion and modernity, and I think that could be very attractive to a lot of different, you know, societies beyond the Middle East. And I'm very curious to see in the next 30 years, as power shifts to the global south, that's not quite the best term, and as we know, the global south is much more religious, if others will also be picking up on these kinds of ideas. You could imagine a more religiously authoritarian future, but you could also imagine a more religious democratic future as well, where religion plays a very important role in more democratic societies, but also, in international relations among them, regional politics among them, where the engagement and the regional interactions also have a religious dimension to them, as we're seeing, I think, within the Middle East.
If I may add something on that, I think we are witnessing both, also the rise, and I think Peter mentioned it, of reactionary group. It's not just one way. I think the fight is even not across religion as much, but within each of them on these two double strands. So it's not that one is taking over, they are fighting, and that's this fight that I think would be interesting also to observe, because it is, in my opinion, central to the role of religion internationally. It can go both ways. It's not just one for democracy, inclusiveness, citizenship, and one for violence and exclusion. I think both are at play in each religious tradition and can be part of strategy on both ways. And I recognize that one book cannot do both, but that's what was, it was for me the background that was missing too, the fact that these movements are also happening on the background of very, very reactionary, intolerant way of living the same religion. And again, it's not particular to Islam right now. So
if I may continue with that line of argument, and also connecting it to Nukhet's argument about a question about the necessary existence of the other, right, with a question mark. And this is really, lies heavily on my mind, because it seems to me that the attempt of the interreligious dialogue actors to formulate an alternative modern project can very easily turn into creating or attempting to create an anti-liberal project, right? Because the dominant one is liberal modernity project. And this is really, the main struggle in the Christian ecumenical movement at the moment, right? Should we unite around, as Christians, around the opposition to the secular, liberal, consumerist, or whatever, individualist, whatever you want to call it? And this is really tempting and quite attractive and successful. Sometimes you look at Viktor Orban of Hungary, right, and his Christian democracy instead of liberal democracy. And there, coming back to your book, because I wonder, because your argument, if I understand correctly, is that even if these state-sponsored interreligious initiatives are, simply scrapped by the rulers because they say we don't need them anymore, as happened in Turkey, still, and correct me if I'm wrong, still already the society is somehow fundamentally changed by the debates, by the discussion of the inclusive citizenship, etc., etc. So there will be a lasting impact on the societies. But I wonder, right, looking at Hungary, for instance, and the heavy support of this kind of illiberal turn there by the society, as only in let's say within 10 years, such a radical change in the attitudes, right? So I wonder, what are the causes of your optimism there, that it will survive even if the policy of the state changes. But again, I think our discussion here shows that the book is so empirically rich and theoretically productive, right? For those who haven't read the book, all of our discussions here are really related to the book because it's all there, right? So it's fascinating. But again, a lot of questions there for me. Thank you.
That's very
Any
kind of
other
you.
take, Nukhet?
Yeah, I can. This makes me, the entire discussion also makes me like there's so much more to be done in terms of like how these interreligious dialogues actually may be a reaction to the inner other. And sometimes it's a good thing. I mean, you know, and sometimes it is not as healthy. I was thinking also about the evangelicals reach out to Patriarch Kirill and how Russia had been like represented as this is the Christian, how the Christianity should look like, and the links between US evangelicals and the patriarch in Russia. And we were talking about this in another platform a few weeks ago. So the reason why these interactions, dialogues, in some cases, not all, are so attractive is because there is more polarization within the religions than before. So, and that's, again, I will follow Peter's lead and say that, you know, the more questions a project can generate for future research, the more successful it is, I think. And as I was reading Michael's book and I was learning new things too, I also had a chance to think about the things I do research on and see them from different angles. So yes, it's a really rich book, but I'm right now like questioning the future of these and the dynamics of these religious dialogues. And the ones in the book are, some of them are examples of that. I mean, the Saudis being involved in this, does that really mean that they will treat the intra-Islam movements within themselves much more like smoothly, or are they trying to control that spheres even more tightly? And this is just a gesture to show that we represent Islam and we can reach out to others. And of course, it's also the new world, and you mentioned this in the book, it's part of like post-Islamism, yes, post-secularism. There is so much communication, democratization of certain networks, and it becomes even more difficult to control the dissenting voices in a religion. So you may want to reach out to those outside actors who were once others, because your new others are actually within the religion. That's but again, thank you, Michael.
Thank you. So we are nearing our time together. Turan, you have been very silent. Anything you would like to add? Or, I mean, you don't have to.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. This has been a great discussion, and I enjoy learning and just kind of meeting some of my colleagues that I admire their work, and just kind of looking forward to more opportunities to engage. Thank you.
Thank you. So Michael, we give you the last word before closing up. Oh, for the people who are still with us, we're going to have, before I give to Michael the last word, we're going to have a session on February 1st on contextualizing sectarianism in the Middle East and South Asia, which is also a new book by young scholars. So stay tuned for the next session. But Michael, please wrap up. Bring us to a temporary closure. Let's put it
to a temporary. Yeah, these require much longer conversations. So I really appreciate it, because this is stimulating all sorts of things in my mind as well. One thing I would say is that it's I agree with what Peter, you know, that my mind is oftentimes going to the debates within the United States about post-liberalism. You know, that Orban looms heavy in a lot of my thinking, and his use of Christian democracy, his abuse of Christian democracy. You know, it's clearly not Christian democracy, but so it's clear that these ideas can be taken in different directions, and that the state can capture them as well. And when state power captures these ideas, they can get shut down. I mean, Turkey and Hungary, I think, are good examples of that. I do want to push back on the, or at least to give I think that by itself, though, needs some qualification. I also think that these ideas, as I say, are out there somehow, and they're powerful, and that we oftentimes underestimate them when we think that, you know, this is just, I don't think that Saudi Arabia can necessarily control some of the religious ideas that it's pumping into the system. I think unexpected things may happen as it encourages its subjects to become citizens. I think that So I think that's going to be interesting to see. So they've invested millions in dialogue, and let's see. That said, the overwhelming power of the state is clear, and I don't want to argue with that. So maybe I'll leave it there. I think it opens up for all sorts of new places. I would say that Orban himself, interestingly, visited Al-Azhar recently and had a very interesting conversation with Al-Tayyab, who is the face of the Human Fraternity document, and he found a lot of interesting common points to talk about, including family values. So again, signs that this dialogue enterprise can go into multiple dimensions. So I'll leave it there. But thank you so much. I really look forward to sharing more time with all of you and taking your reflections into consideration for where I'm going next. Thank you.
Thank you. So let's end up on this positive and optimistic note of Michael. And thank you all for joining us today, and thank you to the panelists, and thank you, Michael, for sharing the findings of your book with us. So we are closing now. Be well, and see you to another session, maybe.
Thank you so much, Jocelyne, for moderation. Bye.
Thank you, Jocelyne. Thanks, everyone. And thanks to our listeners, too.
Thank you. Bye-bye.